Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Jack?
How are you, John?
Very good, mate. Today we thought we would do a discussion looking at staying active and training as you get older.
And we were talking about this before because I think often that general population, particularly in the middle age group, get forgotten about when you talk about physical activity, injuries, rehabilitation.
They're people who, for instance, we have a lot of people who were athletes when they were younger, but they're now 40, 50, 60, and they still want to be active. They're still going to the gym. They're still maybe doing some running. They swim. They're on their bike a lot. And they kind of are not sure where they should take their training or where, what is actually really healthy for them to be doing. They get mixed messages. Sometimes they'll say, my GP said I shouldn't run anymore because my knees will
give out.
All these kind of thing. And
I think the other one too is even for people who may not necessarily have been athletes in their younger years.
But then want to get active and stay active. Yeah.
And thinking about some of the strategies you need to implement to try and mitigate injuries associated with big changes in your training load.
Yeah. I think it's a really key one because I think in general, the community is becoming more health savvy.
Absolutely.
And I think people are very aware that as you get older, you need to stay active. And one of the things that recently I had someone actually ask me, they said, do you think walking is enough exercise? And they were in their sort of mid to late 50s. And I said to them, well, I'm not ever going to discourage someone from walking. It's a really, really good thing to do. Especially, they were ever now, you're on your phone or your watch, they're doing, I'll get my 10,000 steps. And it's actually a really good thing to be doing. Walking is a really great way to keep a level of conditioning.
Particularly too, where there's more and more research coming out that the effect of just prolonged sedentary behaviour is so detrimental to health. And it's maybe a bit of hyperbole, but even correlating it to the impacts of, say, smoking. And I think that's a really important thing to highlight itself is that even doing low intensity exercise like walking, particularly intermittently and breaking up the periods of how long you're sitting, do have very significant effects on your overall health and well-being.
Definitely. However, I will put the caveat in there that it probably isn't enough to expand upon your health parameters. And we do see that as time goes on, as you get older, if walking is the main and only type of exercise that you do, you will still see a significant amount of these age-related changes.
Why is that then, John?
Well, you're probably much more of a well-versed in the research on this, but as we get older, there are some really clear changes that start to occur, particularly in our hormonal profile. And this seems to have quite a significant effect on our ability to maintain muscle mass. It also, we do seem to see a shift in the proportion. It's not necessarily the number, but the proportion of muscle fibers that are type 2, which are your fast twitch. So it's part of the reason why as you get older, you tend to slow down in your ability to create high velocity contractions.
I actually think it's actually just worth highlighting there because it can be misleading that when you refer to fast twitch, we're talking more about the pure fast twitch fibers because you might have some people out there saying, no, but when you rest, you get an increase in the type 2, but that's more of the what you would call hybrids, which seem to be not as functionally relevant.
No, they seem to be these chameleons that
correct
be influenced by the type of activity that you do.
Yeah, and I think the thing there too, and we'll obviously talk more about this, is I think a lot of people disassociate aging as this inevitable thing, almost like a car wearing down, where it doesn't really matter what you can do, you're going to have failure of the system.
For those who are listening and have sort of followed some of this aging science, it's actually a really interesting area of research. And obviously some people would be aware of a guy named David Sinclair, who is an Australian researcher working in the US.
He's at Harvard, isn't he?
He's at Harvard. Yeah. I didn't think that was relevant, Joe.
Just to show you how intelligent he is.
But he makes no bones about it. He thinks that aging is a disease and that you can actually mitigate the effects of aging through a number of different behavioural and nutritional or dietary intake features.
And some of those are contentious, but
yeah, the research is still developing in those areas. We can go down there. Like I think we can easily say that these things are developing and they should not be taken verbatim, even though if you do hear David Sinclair talk, he will make out as if the science is very clear, and it's probably not.
I think the one thing that is very interesting from his research is when you look at what is associated with aging, is you see a decrease in the epigenetic expression of cells. And so just to explain what that actually means, we have to understand that our body is constantly adapting to both endogenous and exogenous stresses. So what I mean by that, environmental stresses, so external things related to sleep, like diet, but that's also somewhat endogenous to pollution, physical activity, and then there's also other factors that occur internally within our physiology that can be related to things like thoughts and belief systems. And the thing that happens with aging, if you're not applying appropriate stresses, is the cell's ability to adapt to stresses becomes impeded. It becomes essentially senescent. So the problem that you have with that is then the ability to create, say, new amino acids or proteins, or be able to regulate the structure of a cell to make sure that it doesn't become doesn't go through apoptosis. Which
what is the word for that? Apoptic.
Apoptic. Yeah.
I don't know. Is that actually the word?
I guess so. I'm not actually
Are we just making words up?
We make up a lot of stuff, don't we? So, no, and a lot of cells are obviously going through apoptosis all the time, but certain cells have limited ability to go through mitosis, i.e. Replicate. A good example of that is things like chondrocytes within cartilage. So if you're not applying stresses intermittently, they become senescent and they lose that ability to maintain.
Let's talk about that, because I actually think we are going into the weeds. So apologies if it gets technical and two, it gets off track. But one of the reasons, and it took me a long time of kind of looking down some of this path, and I think you and I have kind of spoken about this a fair bit. But essentially, aging is in some ways irreversible, in the sense that, as you said, we lose the ability for our cells to respond to adaptation. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them actually is associated with the structure of how DNA actually replicates cells. And it's got to do with this part of the DNA strand called the telomere, which is usually what they call an end cap coding, which says basically stop replicating at this stage. For those people who know how it works with mRNA and it goes along the actual sequence, and then it gets a code on that will say stop coding at this point, stop trying to create a copy of yourself. And the telomere length, that is, the number of sequences on that telomere, keeps the distance away from that stop codon. And in some cells, and you mentioned chondrocytes, it's really interesting because when you are born, you don't start with very long telomeres on those chondrocytes.
Yes.
So the ability for them to continually replicate is diminished.
Another good example is the heart. Is another good example. And you think about someone who goes through myocardial infarction secondary to
doesn't regrow new healthy heart tissue. That's why,
Or teeth are a good example too.
Exactly. And it's the difference between parts of your body or tissues that do have long telomeres and maintain that telomere length over time.
And a good example of that is obviously muscle is a good example.
And bone
or I think of skin.
Exactly. Skin renews all the time. And the factor that really leads to us having this over time reduction is we lose the telomere length, and then that stop codon means that cannot continue to create this replication of our cells.
Yes.
And the cool thing is, the reason that a lot of our behaviors tend to influence our ability to stay youthful or healthy is because they influence an enzyme called telomerase. And I think it was I can't remember the year, but 3 researchers, 2 females and a male, won the Nobel Prize for their research looking at telomerase. And the things that influence telomerase in a positive direction are things like diet, particularly things that are considered, more healthy, which most people would be aware of, but, whole foods, vegetables, and a varied diet. Sleep has a massive influence on telomerase activity. Exercise is a massive one as well. So if you're consistently looking after those things, it essentially keeps you young. And that's why it's really important as you get older to make sure that you're actually, one, obviously consistently getting your health checked, but putting in place behaviors that are positive for an aging system.
I was going to say, what age do you typically see some of those changes occur? Because, I think of obviously through childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, our ability to tolerate stresses, and sometimes they're not always good stresses. It might be excessive alcohol consumption, poor sleep, poor diet, lack of exercise. Your body seems to be pretty good at tolerating dealing with that to a certain point.
And I think that's related to these things.
Absolutely.
It's related to these factors, which is that your body has the ability to replicate and regenerate potentially cells that have died or have been negatively influenced by the negative stresses. And in the same sentence, the behaviors that are considered generally unhealthy, like being sedentary, like eating poorly, smoking, radiation, there's different forms of radiation, obviously. One that most people are exposed to a lot, particularly in Australia, is something like the sun. And that's why excessive sun is good for you, but it needs to be moderated.
Well, excessive sun is not good for you.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I'm saying
the doses in the poison.
A dosage of sunlight is extremely important and valuable for human beings.
The poison is in the dose.
Exactly. So, but we know that if you spend all day, every day outside, especially in a place like Australia, you'll probably end up with skin cancer, right? And that's because radiation itself will affect your ability for your skin cells to regenerate and turn over well, because it affects that telomerase function, and therefore over time it will affect the telomere length of your skin cells.
This is getting off on a bit of a tangent, but one of the other things that influences your exposure to skin damage and skin cancer.
Are you going on a tangent that is like conspiracy theories about sunscreen causes skin?
No, it's not sunscreen. No, it's excessive omega-6 consumption.
Okay. Because
it changes your cellular structure, because the cell membrane is made of essential fatty acids, and they're much more fragile. They're much more susceptible to oxidative stress.
For people who don't know, and again, this is an area that is outside of our scope, but it's essentially something that is becoming really clear in the evidence relating to inflammatory disease, which crosses over with something we'll probably get onto, which is osteoarthritis. Is the omega-6s, which is typically it's seed oils. Is that right, Jay?
You do get omega-6s also in most foods, like even in meat you get it. But the consumption of omega-6 has gone up
enormously,
exponentially, because of the high consumption of industrial seed oils. Yeah. So things like
canola
sunflower, safflower oil, canola oil, soybean oil, which are predominantly omega-6 in terms of their fatty acid constitution.
And they tend to be in processed foods.
Yes. Right? Yeah, well, because they are much cheaper foods. They're usually a byproduct of a lot of monoagriculture, particularly in the States, but also here in Australia. And so, yes, they are a food. They are consumed a lot more within the food system because they're also cheaper.
Yeah. So basically, and this is where the healthy eating comes in. We get conversations from people all the time, but a simple one is if most of your food comes out of packaging, then you're probably not eating that healthy. Even if, whatever it says on the package is healthy, most of your food probably should be made out of things that don't come in a packet.
Yeah, and I think that's actually just worth highlighting. And again, this is very, general, generic in terms of recommendations and understanding, because it's going outside of what we do professionally. But when we talk about diet, we're talking about two things. We're talking about, are you getting adequate nutrient intake? So that's related to macronutrients. When you think about amino acids, there are essential amino acids and also essential fatty acids, which actually does include omega-6, but also omega-3, but being considerate of how much you consume of those. And then also micronutrient intake with vitamins and minerals.
And things like omega-6, omega-3, these different essential fatty acids. Yeah.
Understanding they are essential in the sense that our physiology is dependent on that consumption in order to maintain normal cellular function and physiology. But we have to understand that there is an element too where certain foods in excess can be associated then with nutrient inadequacy, because you are avoiding eating nutrient-dense foods in place of highly processed foods. Yeah. But then also thinking about how that may influence our physiology and then increase things like aging associated with cell dysfunction over time.
I think whilst we're on nutrition, I think it's an interesting point, because one of the key things that's really important as you get older to maintain, and it's heavily associated obviously with healthy aging, is maintaining muscle mass.
Yes, and I think associated with that is understanding then metabolism, and understanding that everyone is going through this continual process of what's called like anabolic stimulus, where you get an increase in protein synthesis, increase in tissue development, and then catabolic stimulus, breakdown of tissue. And you're going through this continuous cycle, which is actually a normal thing. And you can appreciate that for a growing child, the anabolic stimulus is greater than the catabolic stimulus as a net gain. For adults, once you've reached full maturation, it's pretty even. But then as you get into your late 20s, early 30s, you start to see that potential shift, if you're depending on other environmental factors like exercise, diet, and so on, where the catabolic stimulus, so the overall is larger than the anabolic stimulus. So you're getting an overall net breakdown of tissue. And this is a part of aging. This is what we see as what's called, typically people think of it as sarcopenia, so a loss of muscle mass as typically associated with aging. I think it's probably better to use the term dynapenia, because that also describes not only the muscle and bone and fascial tissue loss, but also some of the neural maladaptations associated with
and when we say dynapenia, so people would be aware of the word, like dyna being associated with force. Essentially, dynapenia is a culmination of your reduction in your ability to produce, say, muscle strength, force output particularly, because of, as Jack mentioned, the associated reduction across both your peripheral tissue, that is, your muscles, tendons, fascial connective tissue, as well as the drive from your brain to send a message to increase force output.
Yes. So, and I think that's, when you think about it from that standpoint of, if we have a overall net loss because the catabolic stimulus is staying the same typically, but the anabolic stimulus is decreasing, what kind of things can we do then to amplify that anabolic stimulus?
And that's where, as I mentioned with the food, because what's become really clear is that our requirement for protein intake, particularly as one of the major macronutrients, when we say macronutrients, we're talking, as Jack mentioned before, protein, carbohydrates, and fats. The one that we actually, as we get older, tends to be more required is protein. And it's for very much that reason that Jack mentioned of us becoming generally more towards a catabolic state. And the work of particularly a researcher named Stuart Phillips has demonstrated over and over and over again that as we age, our requirement for protein actually increases. So what we actually find is when you consume protein in general, so that can be both from animal products or non-animal products, we get an increase in what's called muscle protein synthesis just from consuming the protein. So essentially, you've eaten this protein-rich food and it's telling your system, lay down more muscle mass.
Well, I was going to say, there is a caveat to that though too, because as you get older, and this is when you're getting more into like middle elderly stage, you do start to develop what's called anabolic resistance.
Yes.
And so, although that is actually important, regardless, to make sure you increase your protein intake, that alone doesn't provide a signal to the body to increase muscle mass, because there is, i.e., resistance where that signal is not being heard by the cell. But you can sensitize the cells. And this is where the importance of exercise comes in too, because when you think about doing resistance training, you're applying mechanical stress to the tissue that essentially tells the cell that you need to increase the amount of protein synthesis, i.e. new muscle mass, to be able to accommodate and withstand these mechanical forces more effectively. So when you do exercise in conjunction with protein...
That's good, because I think the question that I have for you then is, what is that stimulus from a mechanical sense that's going to create that signal?
Well, actually, this is a good point.
It takes us all the way back to walking.
Yeah.
I know we've gone off the path, but it brings us all the way back to walking. What is that mechanical stimulus, Jack? Like, what signal is going to get that response that we want, especially if it's in conjunction with protein consumption, that will mean that we actually, one, either preserve or even two, lay down an increase in muscle mass.
Yeah. And so this comes to understanding what's called mechanotransduction. And so this is how our cells, our tissue respond to mechanical stress. So when you're walking, there is obviously some level of mechanical stress. You have gravity pulling you down, you make a foot contact, you have a ground reaction force. But with walking, typically that force is going to be limited to predominantly the calf region, just because through human evolution, the design of the calf, Achilles tendon, plantar fascia complex is to be energy efficient, to be able to absorb that ground reaction force and then release it back into the ground. It becomes a bit more complex when we start getting into jogging, and then particularly when you get into sprinting. So when you think about resistance training, you are applying an external force and using certain mechanics and lever arms to create specific mechanical stress to different tissue in the body. So that could be something as simple as doing, say, a biceps curl, where as you hold the weight, particularly at a longer lever arm, you're creating a torque at the biceps brachii, in addition to things like the brachialis and coracobrachialis, well, to an extent.
You're getting too technical.
Yeah. That at a cellular level, that mechanical torsion creates a signal for the cell to go, I need to increase the amount of protein synthesis and create more muscle mass. So this is where it's important to understand that although walking does provide some mechanical stress, and it definitely provides a metabolic stress too, which definitely has its own benefits in terms of the cardiovascular system. We'll talk about that as well, yeah. Yeah. It is limited with the magnitude of mechanical stress it applies, particularly to other major muscle groups. When you think from the knee up, so thinking about hamstrings, quadriceps, gluteals, and then going through the trunk and then into the arms as well. So this is where there is a limitation to only using walking as a form of physical activity, because it's not applying a magnitude of stress that leads to different parts of the body, but also with progressive overload. Because again, for anyone who's participated in exercise, you can appreciate that to create further gains, you need to continue to increase either typically the intensity, but there are obviously other variables that you can influence when you think about the overall volume load or frequency or duration, to make sure that you're challenging the system enough to continue that adaptive process.
And for that reason, that's why, for instance, the ability for people to maintain muscle mass, either the most obvious way is obviously resistance training, so going to the gym, but you will maintain more muscle mass running than you will walking, right? Even if the intensity of that running is not particularly high.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason is because the forces that you are exposed to, particularly under the weight of gravity at a slightly higher velocity, actually is a stimulus. And there's a really famous...
Are you referring to running of just like any higher velocity thing than walking? Or are you referring to sprinting specifically? Or
well, sprinting is going to be an even greater stimulus again.
Sure.
And there is that intersection that does occur between the metabolic stress created from jogging, having some competition,
yes,
right, which we can get into, but again, it's a little bit technical. But even there's a really great paper often it pops up again on Twitter every now and then, or X these days, I guess,
formerly known as Twitter.
Yeah, but it basically shows like a 70-year-old sedentary person's MRI, and it's basically the space in your leg. It's an MRI of someone's leg, their femur, and if you look at it, there's a small layer of muscle around the bone, and then there's a big layer of fat. And then they compare it to a 70-year-old triathlete, and for them, there is obviously the bone's the same size, the muscle layer is much, much, much bigger, and the fat layer is relatively small.
Yes.
But if you look at the circumference of both legs, it's exactly the same. So it's that idea of, we talk about a skinny fat.
Sarcopenic obesity.
Yeah, which is basically someone who doesn't necessarily look like they're carrying a lot of fat mass, but because their muscle mass is so low, their tissue is mostly still made up of fat, right? So if you were to say it as a percentage, you'd say, oh, okay, they have an obesity to their body fat percentage, or the actual constituent parts of whether it's a leg or whatever it is, but they don't look like that. It very much looks like they're much smaller.
Yeah, and that's related to where the fat is distributed, whether it's more within the subcutaneous tissue or around the muscle itself, because that is actually a phenomenon that occurs with muscle wasting, is you actually get fatty infiltrate within the muscle itself. And we see this, for instance, with people, with chronic low back pain, where it's a negative response from underuse for prolonged periods of time.
Yeah, and with that in mind, it suggests two things, because we will get onto metabolic conditioning, or aerobic type exercise, because that has enormous benefits. But if you want to maintain muscle mass, you do need to do things that create enough mechanical tension.
Yes.
Right, and that's one of the things that people, I think, get confused, is that they think, oh, I'm riding a lot or I'm swimming a lot. That doesn't enough to maintain my muscle mass. And it probably is not the case, especially if you're doing those things in much more of an endurance fashion. And we'll get onto why. But the big thing that you need to consider if you want to maintain that force output, we mentioned obviously dynapenia as being a major issue. And it's a major issue for a few reasons, actually. One is it's associated with reduced muscle mass, and reduced muscle mass is actually correlated with poorer health outcomes.
I was going to say that's just worth emphasising that there are many epidemiological studies now highlighting that one of the most protective factors for, I guess, associated with aging, so the prevention of chronic disease, and that relates to whether it's the cardiovascular system, things like cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, type 2 diabetes, is muscle mass. It has such important components to our overall health and well-being that extend beyond just thinking of it being a part of the locomotor system, associated with movement or aesthetic looks.
Yeah. And with that in mind, you need to consider that you need to create enough mechanical force application to your system in order to continue to grow that, in conjunction with, as we mentioned, appropriate nutrition. So the activities that really will drive that are going to be things that are high force or high velocity, or a combination of both. And it's typically not something that's always associated with getting old. I think the one that has become more popular is obviously resistance training, so going to the gym, lifting weights, and as you said, doing it in a progressive fashion where you're trying to slowly get stronger over time. That's going to consistently increase the signaling to the tissue in order to lay down more muscle, or at a minimum maintain it. The reason that's really valuable, apart from the health perspective that Jack just mentioned, is it's heavily associated with things like balance and falls risk, which on the surface, I think when we're younger, we don't think about our ability to maintain balance. We think it's a given. We don't believe we're going to fall over regularly. But it is for the physiotherapists particularly, and healthcare practitioners that work in an aged care environment or an aging environment, whether that be in hospital or in, say, aged care facilities. One of the biggest problems that you tend to face is falls. And the statistics are actually really horrible around falls.
The consequences of them, and particularly for elderly females, yes.
Yeah. So falls are often associated particularly with things like, fractures of the femur or fractures of the hip. It's probably colloquially called, I've broken my hip, but it's typically the femur that breaks. And unfortunately, there's a really high percentage of people that within 12-month period end up actually passing away. And people say, well, why is that? And it's because as soon as you lose your mobility, your function level reduces significantly, and those effects of sedentary behavior take a massive effect on your overall health. Not only your functional capabilities, say walking, getting around, caring for yourself, being able to, cook for yourself and do those things, but also actually it starts to invite other things to go wrong. And one of the key things that actually often goes wrong is as people get more sedentary, they're more at risk of respiratory disease. And the big one that kills people in that period is pneumonia.
Yeah, and I think that's just worth emphasising there, because you can appreciate that if someone unfortunately has a fall and breaks their hip, they do become quite fearful. And so that then can further negatively influence their sedentary behaviour, in the sense that they're more likely to use a gait aid to make sure that they feel stable, which again reduces mechanical load through the legs in particular. It reduces the amount of things like single leg contact time, so that you lose more balance elements over time. And I was just thinking too, like when we think about balance, I think a lot of the time people think of things like
standing on one leg,
standing on an unstable surface.
It's much more, we obviously spoke with, who was it that we spoke with about instability? Was it David Bann?
David Bann was, yeah.
Who's done research on this. And it's not, as much as it sounds stupid, but it's not standing on, an unstable surface trying to juggle while you've got dumbbells, hanging off your arms.
And, well, I'm about to say, just to describe balance, there are different components involved. There are receptor components. When we think about, we use our vision, we use our vestibular apparatus to help us understand where we are in space. There is a sensory input. So we're constantly getting feedback, particularly from our hands and feet, to let us know where we are in space. But then the other big one is the motor output. And this makes sense, because if all of a sudden you get knocked off balance, someone, accidentally shoves you in the shoulder and your center of gravity is perturbed from your base of support, the thing that stops you from falling is your ability to rapidly move your limb to make sure that, exactly, to get your center of gravity back over a base of support. What happens to people as they get older, particularly if they're sedentary? They lose that rate of force development. They lose that ability to rapidly, whether it could be even outstretching a hand or more likely putting out a foot to be able to counteract that external force applied to them. And this is where something like resistance training is really important, because even doing slow velocity but relatively high force, you are improving your rate of force development to an extent. And just to explain, when you think about muscle contracting, you can think about two things. You can think about how much of the muscle is contracting, which is related to something called motor unit recruitment. The more you get the muscle to contract, the more force it can create. But then there's also related to what's called the rate of force development. So how quickly the signal goes from the brain to the muscle to get it to contract very rapidly. So when you do higher force contractions, one thing that's going to maximize your force output is to get that rapid contraction as well. So we do see a benefit from just doing heavy resistance training alone to improve things like falls risk. But we certainly see that amplified further when we start to add a velocity component into it, because if you're starting to create high velocity contractions, and that could be doing things like squatting with a lighter weight but moving faster, it could be doing things like plyometrics, it could be doing things like weightlifting, sprinting drills. These train our body to move our limbs very rapidly, so that we still maintain or ideally enhance the ability to create quick reactions in response to perturbations in our balance.
And I think that's something that we get asked often, actually, is, and that's something that I'm really proud of, actually. We have, classes that come in who do strength training, and in the mornings particularly, and it's generally an older group. I think the youngest people are in their 50s, and, we've got some that are nearly 80. And the really cool thing about it is we're doing what people would probably consider relatively advanced with them. Some of them are doing Olympic type lifts and all sorts of things like that. And this is the exact reason we're doing it. We want them to be able to maintain their force output, but we also know that high velocity component is going to have an effect on a lot of these balance features. And it's really, really important and valuable.
The other thing too that I find quite amazing, and it's amazing how many people underestimate it, is how much change you actually see in this population group.
And again, we spoke about this before, about the telomeres and telomerase. If you do these activities, you maintain the ability for your cells to divide and create more muscle and create more tissue, and neural adaptation continues to occur. It may not be at the same rate. It may not be to the same extent, to the same magnitude, but these people get a lot stronger and they maintain a lot of their muscle mass.
And for the individual, how that translates into their everyday life is very significant, because apart from, say, improving physical attributes, which makes them more confident in themselves, both in the sense of what they can do physically, but I even think about things like appearance, because the reality is, being in shape is something associated with positive,
of course,
positive feelings. But I think the other thing too, and you alluded to this, is some of the other benefits you see with regard to like cognitive sharpness in terms of seeing an improve in your cognitive capacity, or even that shift in your hormonal profile and understanding how, like, the reality is how much of our psychologies and emotions are influenced by our chemical environment is huge.
Yeah, it's massive.
And so it's something that I know for me personally, I quite enjoy working with that general population that's in that middle age group or older, because particularly if there's someone
you see a lot of improvement, and they really enjoy the process.
Massive. And they're very significant improvements to their everyday life.
I think that then it's the good thing you've mentioned there, because it does start to have an effect, particularly on their metabolic health.
Yes.
Right? And I think that's where we can talk about why it's also important for people to do exercise that affects, say, their aerobic conditioning, right? Because that can have a very big effect on their metabolic health.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to sort of outline, what types of metabolic conditioning is useful, and the ways in which you can address that, and maybe some of those underlying features that we start to see change in people's physiology?
Sure, and I think to start with, and we briefly mentioned this before, it's good to make that distinction between something like resistance training versus, you can call it, conditioning, metabolic conditioning, endurance, aerobic training. Probably put that into the same basket.
Yeah.
There are some differences you can think about, submaximal continuous versus intermittent. But
say, for instance, if you go to the gym, that obviously fits into that category of being related to resistance training and high force. If you go for walks, if you like to, swim for 45 minutes, if you like to go for an hour bike ride, they all fit into that ongoing aerobic conditioning.
Yes.
And the big thing that we're probably going to point out is they're both extremely important.
Yes.
Right? None more than the other. They both are really important for you maintaining your physical function as you get older, and they're really important to consider, particularly not only just for health, but they're really, if you want to actually perform well in whatever you're doing, you're going to need contribution from both ends of that spectrum.
Yes, they challenge the systems in different ways, and even at a cellular level, we see different pathways being upregulated in response to, say, aerobic training versus resistance training. But as you mentioned, I wouldn't necessarily say that some people might argue one is better than the other.
Yeah, I don't think that that's the case.
No, they stress the systems in different ways. When we think about aerobic training or doing some type of conditioning activity, we're creating more of a metabolic stress. And the reason for this is the limiting factor, it's not the limiting factor, a key factor associated with your endurance performance is related to your oxidative metabolism, if we're doing more longer distance stuff. So that is your ability to use oxygen as a main fuel for ATP synthesis to fuel your cells to continue to contract and create movement. Yep. And this is where it's important to make that distinction when you think about something like walking. If you're doing long periods of walking, you're essentially sending a signal to your body that I need to become energy efficient. I need to make sure that if I'm going to be out walking for hours a day or going for running, going for long duration runs, I need to make sure that I can use energy efficiently so that I can maintain this activity over time. And if you can appreciate, that's a very different signal to the one I gave before about resistance training, is if I'm applying a really high mechanical stress, I need to create more tissue to make sure I can withstand that mechanical stress. Understand, though, that when you create muscle mass, it does actually use more energy. It actually increases your metabolism. And that's one of the other benefits of resistance training, because the more muscle mass you have, the higher resting metabolic rate you have, and therefore lower rates of things like becoming overweight or obese. But going back to aerobic training, so this sends a signal to the cell. It typically causes what's called mitochondrial biogenesis. So again, I won't get too much into the weeds, but understand that mitochondria is essentially our powerhouse. It creates energy to fuel our cells, and it's in particular very effective at doing what's called oxidative or aerobic metabolism, and uses oxygen, which is a much more efficient way to create energy. And so the more aerobic training we do, the more we create mitochondria to make sure that you can effectively use oxygen in metabolism. I think the other benefit, though, too, to be fair, you do get this with things like resistance training as well, is you'll get an up regulation or you get an increase in things like heart rate. And with that, you'll get an increase or more fluctuations in things like blood pressure within your vascular system. That's actually very, very beneficial. And like I said, you do actually get that with resistance training as well, because you can appreciate when you're doing resistance training, there's a lot of fluctuations in blood pressure as well. That maintains things like elasticity of your arterial wall. And the importance of that is you want the arterial wall to be able to dilate effectively with increases in blood flow, because that helps maintain a healthy blood pressure, particularly resting blood pressure. Because we know that arterial stiffness is associated with typically with high blood pressure, which is associated with things like cardiovascular disease, because you're more likely to get shear stress within the arterial wall that leads to damage, accumulation of like inflammatory process that builds up atherosclerosis and things like that.
So with that in mind then, like what are the things, like is it important for people to maintain this idea that they have to keep both of those activities going as they get older?
It seems that having variability and diversity in the stresses you apply to your body and therefore the physical attributes you develop is very effective for health and well-being. Because again, we're talking about the general population here who they're not worried about, well, they may be participating in competitive sport, but it may just be more related to optimizing their health and well-being. Diversity does seem to be an effective approach. I think what is important is to make sure that you maintain a balance between how much aerobic versus how much resistance training you do, because there is the potential for what's the word I'm looking for? Like for a
it competes with each
competing
other.
signal, exactly, because they literally upregulate different pathways in the when you think about it from a cellular level.
We'll put that caveat in there because it's really important. We often, and this would be the same. I'm sure we get the same question. It tends to be the case that as people get older, they tend to do less explosive things. I would say not everyone, but people tend to take up more cycling, or they take up swimming, or they'll still be running. They'll do, and we're talking people, as I said, probably more in the middle age. As you get older again, people tend to go into more sedentary activities even further, things like golf, or they may still swim, or they may still ride a little bit, but it tends to be less. And the thing that you have to be aware of, because we get this question all the time, which is, if I do gym and I'm trying to, get my half marathon or marathon better, am I going to put on muscle mass? The reality is that unless you're doing a significant proportion of your training as resistance training, i.e., you're doing 5 sessions of gym and only 2 sessions of running, the likelihood is that the vast majority of the activity you do, being, say, running, is going to outcompete that signal. And you will build some more muscle mass, but you're unlikely to put on a hell of a lot more size. The thing that you will probably get mostly, which is the benefit, is you'll get stronger.
Well, I was going to say, when it comes to concurrent training, doing aerobic exercise and then adding on resistance training typically leads to a better outcome, a better gain. It's actually typically the other way around where it's more problematic, where if you're someone who does predominantly resistance training, you want to maximize or optimize muscle mass, and you start implementing aerobic training, you impede the effect from resistance training. If you're someone who does predominantly aerobic training and then adds in gym, that's actually an enhancing effect.
Yeah,
you typically see, that's when you start to see a big differentiation in performance.
And I know we've kind of, we started this and we were talking about, if you're training as you're getting older and you're doing sport or activity, and we sort of diverted very much into the ideas around health and healthy aging. And the reason is exactly what Jack basically just spoke about, which is understanding the benefits that you get depending on what you're doing by combining your understanding of the type of exercise that you do, as well as the benefit you get by having some of those additive effects. So one of the key things that we spend a lot of time educating people on, if they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s, is generally people know to continue doing aerobic activity, it seems.
Well, I'm going to say, we have spoken about this before, but particularly in Australia, there is a stronger narrative towards doing aerobic conditioning, which is fine, but it's more about the education of resistance training and its benefit, both for overall health and well-being, but actually, as I mentioned before, enhancing your aerobic performance as well, understanding how it can influence your efficiency.
Because the thing that I would say is, if you're someone who is getting older, the thing that tends to drop off is not your endurance capability. What tends to drop off is your force output and the velocity of that force that you can produce. So,
and that makes a lot of sense when you think about even from a professional standpoint.
We spoke about,
Well, and just thinking about like professional athletes, you see a lot more marathon runners in their 30s, 40s.
Yeah, even in Australia, like we've got a bit of a golden age of female distance runners, and it's being led by two mothers who are in their mid-40s.
Yeah, wow.
Right, it's really impressive, but they're getting better as they're getting older.
Yes.
And that demonstrates that you maintain so many of those properties.
Yes, yeah.
And so one of the key things that, was really one of the reasons why we wanted to talk about this was we spend a lot of time encouraging people that if they're doing their running activity, their cycling, to make sure that they're also doing activities that maintain the features for them to have high level of performance. And it's generally things like strength training that will assist with that. And there's two reasons that it assists. One is it actually improves the functional capabilities, and you mentioned something like running efficiency is a big one. We know that it improves, say, the elastic properties that people have, so you can bounce along using less energy and still being able to output a higher speed or similar speed. But the second thing that it does is it's very protective for injury, especially as you get older. And I think one of the things that's really important is, as time goes on, it's becoming more and more evident that particularly strength training itself, and I think I don't actually have the research on this. It would be interesting, I don't know if you do, Jack, with this, is of whether that has been backed up also in older populations. But it's very, very clear that in active younger populations who participate in sport, resistance training and strength training is protective for the development of injuries basically across the board.
Well, right? It's certainly, I'm not sure if they looked at injuries in general, but certainly one that has been highlighted and studied extensively is the balance issues and the falls risk, which is more for the more elderly population.
Yeah, so I think the big things that and actually one of the other ones I wanted to ask you actually.
Yeah.
It's obviously, I know you always talk about this, but it's flexibility, right?
Yeah.
And I think the big things that you're trying to do, because naturally, and this is probably where I'm leading, is as you get older, endurance is reasonably well maintained if you're doing activity. What isn't that well maintained is your strength and your force output and your velocity. The other thing that's not particularly well maintained as you get older is your range of motion and your flexibility. So the other key component that I think is really important to consider as you get older is maintaining, or even hopefully maybe enhancing those. And you're the person who's got much more knowledge in this.
Yeah.
I love the saying that you always bring up, which is that flexibility is not something that you gain, it's something that you lose. And therefore, if you're not undertaking some sort of activity to enhance your flexibility, it's going to diminish over time.
As soon as you ask that question, I think of a study that was done a few years back. I can't think of, in the last 10 years. It was a very big study, like thousands of participants, and they looked at assessing their ability to go from sitting cross-legged on the floor to standing to sitting back down, and how effectively they could do that. So ideally, you can sit cross-legged on the ground and you can stand up from that position without using your hands in a controlled fashion and sit back down. They did this, thousands of participants looked at over time, marking at how effectively they could do that task to mortality. And people who could do that less effectively had an increased all-cause mortality. And at first,
it's not surprising.
Yeah, and people might think like, well, that seems a bit strange. Like, what's the correlation? Well, the correlation is that's actually a measure of your overall functional capacity, because it measures, certainly there's a component of strength there, but it's also a big factor related to flexibility, how easily you can
flexibility,
move.
Balance.
Yes.
Dynamic is a dynamic function, coordination,
and
so
I
many
think,
things.
Yeah, and I think about too, just for everyday living, I mean, don't get me wrong, doing heavy squats is really important and valuable, but a lot of things that we do are kind of awkward where, you're leaning on one leg, you have to reach under something, you have to put yourself in an awkward position to reach up to a high cupboard. And these are all the things that, if you're older, you can, one, be susceptible to injury if you're not, don't have the physical capacity, or then you may stop doing them because you're like, I don't feel safe doing that. That then further emphasizes that negative cycle of being more and more sedentary. So that study or that example of being able to sit to stand to sit from cross-legged position, you need to have a level of flexibility. You can be as strong as you want, but if you don't have the ability to be able to produce that force through range and open up through your hips, you're in trouble. So we've talked about this plenty of times in other podcasts, but it's such an important thing too when you think about resistance training, and it becomes more obvious as you get older, is training through a large range. But to be able to do that, you've got to have that underlying flexibility.
So I think, the biggest things for people to take out of this, if you're someone who wants to stay active and wants to stay healthy as you age, particularly I would say, from essentially probably 40 onwards, you need to consider, is the activity that I'm doing maintaining my muscle mass? Am I maintaining my aerobic conditioning? Am I adequately, applying the stresses across a variety of different tasks? And am I able to actually do so in an environment that is enhancing my health, i.e., the nutritional side of things we spoke about?
And just to emphasize that, emphasize the point we made before, is don't underestimate how adaptive you still are as you get older. And in fact, I was just reading an article recently looking at the value of resistance training for middle-aged women with bone strength.
Yes.
And we've spoken about this before, and a lot of people are probably aware of some of the issues with the development of osteopenia or potentially osteoporosis, particularly in postmenopausal women. The body and the skeletal system, in this example, still has the ability to adapt. It's not essentially a thing of, I didn't do it when I was younger, therefore it's just a matter of time. You have still capacity to build physical capacity, and that includes things like muscle mass, things like bone mass, things like aerobic capacity that influences your metabolic health, to optimize your health and well-being, mitigate things like chronic disease formation and overall mortality, and just even how you overall feel.
Overall, stay active. If you have questions, do reach out to us. Obviously, it's an area that we spend a lot of time working with people. People probably think that we only work with high-level athletes, but most of what we do is probably related to active people across the whole spectrum of age. So if you have questions, you have anything that you want to ask or any ideas you want to explore, feel free to reach out to us on any of our social media platforms or via our website.